I'm Laura Carpenter, and I'm actually right there with you. I'm Director of Multicultural Living here at Madison, but I really want to introduce my pastor, the pastor of Madison Square Church. He's been pastoring here for 30 years, and his name is Dave Beelan. And I'll let you, Pastor Dave, tell him anything else you want to tell him about yourself before we get to the questions.
31 years, actually.
Wow.
And hello, Geneva College. I was there last year in January with Ricardo. So, hello. Yeah, why don't you just ask your question and off we go.
Okay. So you've been here 31 years.
Yep.
What have been the high points of leading a multicultural church?
Well, a lot of the immediate things that come to my mind is the richness of being challenged, thinking of faith in ways that I hadn't thought of before. Or, for example, there's songs that I learned right away, and I learned to sing songs that would get into my heart and body in a different way than the hymns that I would sing as a child. Mm-hmm. And so I noticed that I started worshiping using my body way more than I did before. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't just sitting in one place. And because we're supposed to love the Lord God with our whole heart, soul, mind, and strength, I think different cultures understand how to do that better, so that there's a richness. I think the stories that people tell about the faith of their ancestors, usually their parents and grandparents, mm-hmm. sometimes it goes back farther than that, mm-hmm. Enriches my faith tremendously. So those are a couple of things there. I would say that it reminds me of when I got married. I had heard what women are like, and then I married one, and I found out I was wired a whole lot differently. And some of it was male and female. Mm-hmm. And so it challenges me to grow in the fruit of the Spirit, because I have to be patient in ways that I wasn't patient before, mm-hmm. and I didn't even realize I was impatient. I had to realize there was a different mental map out there about how to see the world. Mm-hmm. And that happens, I think, at least as much in a multi-ethnic or multicultural environment, because people come with mental maps that at first you can't even figure out, and then once you do, you go, oh, okay, well I see that differently now. So it's just growing as a human being.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the flip side of that would have been the low points.
The low points are, we've got, especially between black and white in the United States, we have 400 years of bad history. Mm-hmm. And because of that, it's easy to get lost in or barriers of emotions and misunderstandings. Mm-hmm. And because there's so much back there, and it's such a part of our fabric and the way we relate to one another, that you have to have a lot of patience, and you've got to have perseverance, and you have to be able to be hurt or angry. Mm-hmm. And stay with it. Mm-hmm. You've got to be able to deal with your guilt. So Jesus looms really large in multicultural living. And I guess that's not a negative. I'm just saying that I need Jesus a lot, because mm-hmm. white guilt is really strong. Mm-hmm. And you have to go to Jesus for it, not to someone with black skin. They already have a big enough burden to bear. And black people have got to deal with their own anger and bitterness, and they've got to take that to the cross too, and not take it out on the people that they're trying to work with. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's just times when I'm embarrassed about how I misunderstand a person of a different race. Mm-hmm. And there's low points. There's also low points when people who say they're committed and say this is a calling on my life, and then it gets really hard, they leave. And I understand their reasons, but we can't have leavers. We got to have people that stick with it no matter what.
Right. So even at the lowest point, that doesn't give us license to quit.
Yeah, right.
You have to keep going.
Yeah.
I like the perseverance word. And I remember once when we were having a low point moment. I don't know if you remember this workshop we had a number of years ago. And after the workshop was done, all 20-some of us folks from Madison who were there stayed. The other workshop attendees left. And we basically it was kind of an argument and lot of disagreement and a lot of pain, and you could just feel the heaviness in the room. And I could feel people thinking, is this worth it? What did I sign up for? Why am I here? Why even do this? And you said, and I think it was critical as our pastor, that this is hard work, but no matter how hard it gets, we're committed to this. And I think it was critical for your congregants and leaders in your congregation to hear you say, yeah, right now, we all want to throw in the towel, but we're not going to. And I think that's critical.
And let's just say it was 10 years ago. My kids would have been 20, 18, and 17. And they're all brown skinned. So my wife and I adopted mixed race children. And I may have also said something like, our family can't afford us to quit.
Right. It's true.
And we can't quit on each other. So, and mixed race families have that kind of investment in this community of faith.
That's good. Okay, so I'm going to give you a choice in this these two questions. So what you can either answer, what have you learned about yourself in this work, or how have you seen growth in yourself being engaged in this work?
If the question was how have I changed? Well, I got raised in a white home in black neighborhoods by a father who, one of his heroes was Martin Luther King Jr. He's 85 years old now, and I saw him weep for the first time when I was 12, and that was on the night that Martin Luther King was shot. And I was raised in a home, and I don't think this was on purpose, but what happened was our family thought of ourselves as white people who get it. So I tended to think that I didn't have much to learn. And when you think you don't have much to learn, you're not going to learn. So I learned I was proud and stubborn. So I had to get rid of that. And another thing I had to do was I'd done a lot of reading, and I had a very good education from a denomination that prides itself in education, and I did well in school, and I had parents that taught me to read and read widely. So I actually had a lot of knowledge, and I had enough street smarts too, because I was raised in the hood, so to speak. I mean, Grand Rapids, if it's a hood.
As hood as we can.
Yeah, that's right. What I found myself doing is that even when black people would talk about their own experience, I found myself discounting it because of what I knew.
Right.
And I had to quit doing that. And actually marriage helped me with that too, because I would try to tell Melanie how she felt, and I couldn't get away with that. So I thought, okay, these aren't very good things to tell people, but I had to grow, and I think now I tend to go into a default position of saying, that doesn't sound right to me, but I better listen because you have a different experience than I do, and who am I to tell you what you've experienced? Well, I need to learn from you. I've learned to see that I have blind spots, that even to this day I have blind spots.
That's good. Okay, I'm going to talk about you're going to talk about the Anti-Racism Initiative. So we have an anti-racism team, and for at least 10 years, we've been a part of this anti-racism initiative with 2 other churches, and we use an analysis for understanding racism that I'll talk about more with you guys. But I want to ask you, Pastor Dave, how has the anti-racism initiative, do you think, impacted the multicultural ministry at Madison?
Well, part of the impact is that it's been, those workshops are some of our most uncomfortable times, because you're in it for 2.5 days, and the stuff we look at, if we just think of history itself, not even deal with like what we're feeling right in the room at the time, it's pretty ugly stuff. The statistics of the number of people that have been actually killed because of racism is huge. Just the Atlantic Passage in itself, the way they stacked people in like cargo into ships, it was horrid, and it's just hard to deal with. But you have to deal with the truth. You can't paper it over. I think the other thing that it points out is that we need to have a common understanding of what racism is, and kind of a simple way to talk about it is that when white people talk about what they call racism against themselves, it's usually personal prejudice, and it's about their feelings getting hurt about something.
That's good.
And it usually doesn't cost them something in terms of getting into a program, a college. They don't usually have stories of their parents and grandparents not being able to get a loan or get into a neighborhood or have something physical or a legal right taken away from them.
Right.
And for black people, they also have stories of personal hurt. But they almost always, when they talk about racism, talk about a system that oppressed them. And so the experience of racism between white people and black people is so totally different from each other that if you don't unpack that and help people understand it, we can pretend that we're overcoming racism, and we don't even realize that we're not dealing with the same kind of history and the same kind of terminology. So the most helpful thing, I think, is to understand, basically for white people to understand the different experience that people of color have in terms of racism.
That's good. Okay, so one of the things that we ask folks to do after they go through a workshop is something called caucusing. And we do caucusing because we think it's important to deal with our identity. And that's what caucusing is about. So we realize that race has messed us up. It's messed white people up in a certain way, giving white folks a false sense of superiority. And for people of color, it gives us a false sense of inferiority or oppressiveness or victimization, I guess we could say. And so we believe it's important to come together as one collective, but then to separate and deal with our own stuff. So white folks deal with their stuff, people of color deal with their stuff. So we do officially caucus at Madison with the other two churches that we work with. But we also have something called a People of Color Gathering that we do. And I just want you to speak to the value or the importance that you see caucusing brings to our work.
Well, I know it's tough. I think it's tougher for white people to caucus than for people of color to caucus. And I think it's partly because they're not used to talking about race, and that they're on the side of benefiting from privilege, and most of the time they don't see it very well. So I think you need people in the white caucus who can help lead it more than you need it in people of color caucus. So that's just a comment on being wise about how you set it up and who leads it. I think there's a resistance to it because it sounds like separation and the gospel is coming together.
Right.
But we already practice this in other ways. Even as a pastor, sometimes I'll have a couple in the room.
Yes.
And because I want the guy to be able to speak freely and not worry about how he might, if he says it too quickly or unedited, he might hurt his wife. And he just needs to say it. So I'll sometimes say, honey, you go leave the room for a while, let me just talk to him, and then I'll switch around, just to give them the freedom of being able to answer my questions without having to also think, how's this going to affect my wife's or my husband's heart at the moment. So that's an example, but more prominent examples are sometimes we separate men and women on a couples retreat because we want the men to just hear from a guy or maybe not. Maybe they need to hear from a woman leader. We separate teenagers apart sometimes so that they can talk about things that they hold in common. So I think you have the pattern already set, and you just need leaders, especially pastors, to say, we're doing this on purpose, and it's actually to help us when we come back together again, to be able to understand each other, our own identity issues better when we're speaking to the other side, so to speak. It's helpful. Yeah,
it is helpful, and it's not something that's easy to do, I would say. I think we do have people who question why we do it, both people of color and white people. And we always are continually educating and re-educating people that this is a value. And it just same way it helps to make the marriage stronger, it helps to make us stronger.
If you had a black church and a white church trying to do this, it would probably be easier. But our whole thing all the time is we're a multicultural church, we're overcoming barriers, we sing songs about it, we hear sermons about it. This sounds like putting barriers up.
Right.
So that's why you have to do it well.
Right, that's good. Okay, Pastor Dave, we're going to get ready to come to a close, but so I'm thinking that the pastors who are listening to us, who are pastors, are either on the journey or thinking maybe we want our church to become more multicultural. So what words of wisdom would you offer these pastors, no matter where they are on the journey?
Okay, well, if you're a white pastor, recently I heard Curtis DeYoung say that if you're a white leader and you're working in multicultural ministry and you don't have a person of color who mentors you, you're not really being serious. So I would say ask God for that, and then go look for someone who can mentor you as a white leader. Mm-hmm. I'd also say that this is something we spent 400 years getting our mess into, and I don't think it'll take 400 years to get out, but it'll take some time. So you need to persevere, and I think you need to continually look at the cross, because Jesus is the one who suffered for us to reconcile God to us, and if we need resources, we look to Jesus himself.
That's good. I'm sitting here thinking while you're talking, this final question might be redundant, and if it is, tell me.
Okay.
So, because I have another, there's some final points I have in my head too, but as you approach retirement, how would you describe the next ideal pastor of Madison?
Well, that person would have to be able to live with ambiguity and manage conflict well. Mm-hmm. They have to be comfortable in their own skin. Mm-hmm. Whether they're white or of color, mm-hmm. they've got to understand the racial history of their race and the United States. Mm-hmm. They've got to be able to lead by example. So they've got to live. They've had to have a track record of living reconciliation. It's not something you can just talk about. You have to live it. Mm-hmm. And actually, the farther back it goes in your life, probably the more rooted it is. So mm-hmm. I would say someone would have to have all those things. They can't be a conflict avoider. That's Amen. For sure.
Amen.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess the note I want to add, one of the hopes that we have as a church is not just to be a black and white church, because we're not just a black and white church. We're about 80% white. Of the people of color, we probably have mostly African Americans, but we have a good amount of Africans, African-born Africans, Koreans, and a growing Latin population as well. So when we talk multicultural, we're going to have to begin to think multiculturally, and a lot of our conversation has been around black and white. Mm-hmm. And one of the burdens that I feel from the Lord is that we begin to really pull other peoples into this conversation. Right. Our Indian-born folks, our Latin folks, our Asian folks around here, our African folks, especially folks who are internationals, don't always understand the importance of this conversation, but that we begin to help them get that. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that as we close, but that's where I kind of see us going.
Well, that's certainly true for this church. Mm-hmm. And I think some churches will be multi-ethnic in a different way, that they're mostly Korean and Caucasian or something like that. But we've become much more internationally flavored in the last decade. Mm-hmm. And that's just different. It actually takes extra work and more sensitivity. I think it's beautiful. I think that's mm-hmm. what God's after. Mm-hmm. And if you go into the local Walmart around here, that's what you're going to see. Right. So if we're going to be culturally relevant, mm-hmm. some of our churches need to look like that.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that's it. We'll talk more about this whole idea of being really multicultural, and hopefully this has helped you. And thank you, Pastor Dave.
Thank you, and God bless you.